Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Mark Ettensohn. Welcome to Heal NPD. To assess personality, we need to ask two questions. First, what is the personality style? Are they depressive, avoidant, paranoid, narcissistic, etc.? The second question is about severity. What is the person's overall level of distress and dysfunction? In this video, we'll take a closer look at the narcissistic personality style in its most severe form, called psychotic personality organization. So let's get started. Personality is best understood as a complex set of adaptations. We develop ways of getting our psychological needs met and ways of protecting ourselves from harm. Many of these adaptations are made in early childhood, and they're based on the intersection between genetics and experience. We end up with one or more dominant personality styles. These are characteristic ways of thinking, feeling, perceiving, and behaving that are defined by core conflicts and central beliefs that each of us has about ourselves and about other people. The narcissistic personality style involves adaptations around the issue of self-esteem. To defend against self-esteem collapse, defenses are utilized that seek self-esteem inflation. These defensive adaptations protect the self and attempt to compensate for internal self-esteem resources that are otherwise lacking. The effectiveness of these defenses mostly depends on the level of dysfunction in the personality. Individuals on the healthier end of the narcissistic spectrum tend to utilize flexible defenses that help them resolve conflicts while increasing social support. Individuals at the more severe end tend to use defenses that are disruptive to their daily lives, damaging to their relationships, and even ones that distort reality. All of this is tied to a person's developmental maturity and the severity of the disturbances that are caused by the central conflict around self-esteem. As someone moves up the spectrum of developmental maturity, their use of problematic defenses goes down. And this is true for any personality style, not just narcissistic. The more integrated, stable, and defined our self-image, the less we need to rely on reality-distorting, boundary blurring, or truth-obfuscating defenses. This developmental spectrum is defined by several distinct levels of personality organization, each of which contain a developmental challenge that must be successfully negotiated to move to the next level. The first challenge is learning to tolerate reality. This level is called psychotic organization. Psychotically organized individuals have difficulty maintaining a consistent perception of what's real. Images of the self and of other people are subject to extreme distortions, and the personality is chronically overwrought by its own preoccupations and anxieties, typically concerning loss of self. The next challenge involves recognizing that the self is separate from other people. This level is called borderline organization, and it's typically marked by profound confusion about boundaries between the self and others. Borderline psychologies also struggle with internal consistency, utilizing a defense called splitting, which collapses ambiguity and ambivalence into simplified polarizations that are either all good or all bad. These are also sometimes called part objects. As with psychotic organizations, borderline organizations are dominated by anxiety about loss of self, and the clinical term for this is paranoid anxiety. The main developmental task in borderline organizations is called individuation. It's how we emerge as a separate self with a stable, integrated identity. Next, the personality moves from split-off part-object relationships to integrated whole-object relationships, and this level is called neurotic organization. Here, a person's identity is integrated and individuated. They also have mostly stable, integrated images of other people. At this level, defenses focus on defending loved ones from fantasized harm caused by the individual's angry feelings or destructive impulses. The dominant anxiety stops being about loss of self, and it begins to concern object loss. The clinical term for anxiety about object loss is neurotic anxiety. Neurotic organizations are dominated by guilt, and neurotic defenses tend to focus on things like repression or reaction formation that attempt to conceal destructive impulses and fantasies from the self and from other people. The main developmental challenge at the neurotic level is learning to tolerate loss, and also to create a realistic perspective on the self's destructive capacities. The person must learn that angry or destructive fantasies and impulses don't necessarily need to be hidden from awareness. They're facts of life, and they can be channeled in productive directions that actually enhance relationships rather than destroy them. The final level of development is called healthy organization. At this level, the focus is on authenticity, relationships, and self-actualization. Healthy organization is characterized by flexibility and affiliation. The person relies on healthy defenses that don't distort reality, don't blur boundaries, and that aren't overly concerned with hiding or concealing authentic needs and feelings. Instead, healthy defenses focus on strengthening social bonds and channeling conflicts in productive directions. These include things like humor, altruism, and sublimation, which is when feelings like anger or frustration are channeled into work, art, or fitness. Healthy individuals still have central wounds and core conflicts, but they've developed internal resources to manage those conflicts in ways that are less costly and provide benefit both to themselves and to other people. So in this video, we'll focus on the psychotic level of organization as it presents in narcissistic personality styles. Remember, these are styles that are dominated by vulnerabilities and self-esteem, and the psychotic organization represents the lowest level of personality development, and it also involves the most severe symptoms. Thanks to popular media, people confuse the word psychotic with images of stalkers, serial killers, or killer clowns with red balloons. But the term simply means that someone has lost contact with reality. Recognizing what is real and what is not is a foundational mental ability, but it's not something with which we're born. Very young children don't have enough experience to reliably distinguish fact from fiction. Roughly speaking, what are the odds that a monster is hiding under your bed? For most adults, that calculation occurs almost instantaneously. But 5-year-olds, on the other hand, might spend hours lying awake at night trying to figure it out. But experience is only part of the story. We also need to grow and develop mental functions that reliably track and negotiate what's real. And these are sometimes called ego functions. Most of us have adequate ego functions to distinguish fact from fiction by the time we're adults. We don't fundamentally alter our perception of the world when we encounter stress. For example, getting rejected from a job application can be difficult to tolerate, but we find ways to accept the reality and move forward. That ability is due to our mature ego functions. Someone without such capacities might instead construct a delusion to protect themselves from the intolerable reality of rejection. Perhaps that the job rejected them because of a government conspiracy to deprive them of gainful employment. The key to understanding psychotic organization is that the mind is not mature enough in its ego functions to hold reality as a constant. Instead, it bends reality to neutralize threats, often altering self-image and object relations in dramatic ways in the process. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not necessarily discussing psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. I'm discussing a level of personality development that is characterized by periodic or chronic lapses in reality testing, typically in response to emotional distress or perceived threat. One article from 2014 puts it like this: psychotic organization is characterized by failure of defensive regulation to contain the individual's reaction to stressors, leading to a pronounced break with objective reality. End quote. Otto Kernberg, who is generally credited with introducing these concepts, writes that, quote, reality testing is severely impaired in psychotic organization. End quote. We all distort reality in response to psychological threats when we're young. Children often have wildly unrealistic ideas about themselves and about the world around them. They tend to treat thoughts and actions as equivalent. They may believe that something happened simply because they imagined it. They may cope with difficult feelings by altering their perception of events. When I was about 3 years old, my parents had just separated, and I began to see phantom creatures floating across my room at night. They'd come out of one wall, move across the floor, and then disappear into the opposite wall. I'd see circus animals, dragons, unicorns, and other figures. I called them shadows, and they were terrifying because I could see them with my waking eyes. These hallucinations lasted for a period, and then one night they simply went away, and I never saw them again. People tend to shrug when I tell them about this. Kids have vivid imaginations. They have imaginary friends. They see things that aren't there, or sometimes selectively don't see things that are there. Reality is fluid when we're young. It's a period of development where our relationship with reality is still being negotiated. Given good enough experience, most people grow beyond this psychotic phase of development. Its legacy remains in the form of whimsy, art, and creativity. However, significant trauma in early life can be disruptive to normal development. If things are too frightening or too overwhelming, if early experience is a chaos of unreliable caregivers, emotional double binds, or unthinkable situations that the mind simply can't process, then the necessary ego functions may not develop in a reliable way, leaving the adult personality vulnerable to psychotic distortion under stress. People with psychotic organizations don't necessarily appear, quote, crazy, or even severely mentally ill. Their issues may only become apparent when they encounter a psychological threat. In the case of narcissistic personalities, these issues would most likely manifest when the person experiences a situation that threatens their self-esteem. Psychologist and author Nancy McWilliams provides an effective portrait of psychotic organization. She writes, "There are many people walking around whose basic psychotic-level internal confusion does not surface conspicuously unless they're under considerable stress. It's useful to conceive of some people who may never become diagnosably psychotic as nevertheless living in a symbiotic psychotic internal world. They function, sometimes quite effectively, but they strike one as confused and deeply terrified, and their thinking feels disorganized or paranoid." End quote. For someone with a narcissistic personality style, who's organized at the psychotic level, insecurities about self-worth may manifest in reality-distorting ways. They may believe themselves to be literally perfect, invincible, or to have special powers. Or they may engage in disturbing devaluations of self that are also not reality-based. For example, in some individuals, body dysmorphia can represent a psychotic distortion of self-image. Psychotic distortions can also affect the perception of social relationships. Individuals may distort interactions and events in the service of perceiving themselves to be perfect, powerful, rich, or beautiful. When confronted with facts that disprove their claims, such individuals will typically retreat further into delusion or engage in paranoid projections and devaluations. McWilliams notes that psychotic process in such individuals is, quote, pre-verbal and pre-rational. And that means that it belongs to a very early stage of mental development. She writes that psychotically organized individuals use reality-distorting defenses to protect against, quote, a level of nameless dread, so overwhelming that psychotic distortions are less terrifying than the dread against which they defend. This is another key in understanding psychotic organization. These individuals are beset by profound terror that they can't verbalize or even symbolize. And by that I mean that the actual anxieties can't properly be represented in the individual's mind. The ego functions needed to do that simply haven't been developed. The self is too fragile, too small, and too unintegrated to withstand troubling realities. Instead, distressing experience must be expelled or disguised by psychotic defenses. This terror or dread is almost always existential, and it's the sort of fear that healthier individuals tend to repress. Healthier individuals also develop a self-structure that's resilient enough to withstand its own fears of annihilation. But in psychotic organization, the self-structure is not galvanized. It doubts its own existence. McWilliams writes, "They may not be fully sure that they exist. They are deeply confused about who they are, and they usually struggle with basic issues of self-definition. They cannot depend on a sense of continuity of identity in themselves, and do not experience others as having continuity of self either. When asked to describe themselves or other important people in their lives, they tend to be vague, tangential, concrete, or observably distorting. The critical thing for therapists to appreciate is that close to the surface in people with psychotic-level psychologies, one finds both mortal fear and dire confusion." End quote. As stated previously, psychotic organizations involve paranoid anxiety, which is anxiety about loss of self. They're terrified of being obliterated, dissolving into non-being, experiencing traumatic loss of control over their bodies, or being taken over psychologically. This anxiety can easily overwhelm the individual's rudimentary ego functions, leading to the psychotic distortions that characterize this level of organization. The psychotic self-structure is not developed enough to hold strong feelings. It must externalize them or transform them into concrete metaphors. It can't take responsibility for its own feelings. It must view them as coming from outside the self. It can't tolerate stressful or confusing emotional contradictions. It must split the self to preserve a basic sense of goodness, or it must collapse ambiguity into reality-distorting, one-dimensional perceptions. The weak or compromised ego functions that characterize psychotic organization also cause reliance on reality-distorting defense mechanisms. The Psychotic Defense Mechanisms Rating Scale, or PDMRS, is one way that psychologists assess some of these defenses. Now, it's important to understand that anyone could regress to the use of one or two of these defenses in the face of a severe crisis. It's only when a person tends to use these sorts of defenses habitually that we begin to suspect psychotic organization. Here are some of the defenses described by the PDMRS. Psychotic denial. This is when a person engages in wholesale denial of any reality that is too frightening or too stressful to tolerate. An example of this might be someone diagnosed with a serious illness who fails to take even minimal steps to address the diagnosis and obtain treatment, instead behaving and feeling as though the diagnosis never happened. Distortion. This is when a person grossly alters or reshapes internal or external reality. For example, I once got into a minor verbal conflict with a man at a dog park. He had parked very close to my car, and as a result, I wasn't able to open my door. After getting out the passenger side, I asked him to please move his car, which caused him to become visibly agitated. Now, I wasn't doing anything threatening, but clearly he felt threatened by the mere fact of my frustration. Out of the blue, he said, "You know what happens if you hit me, right?" Now, I was taken aback because I hadn't threatened to hit him. I just wanted him to move his car. But the look in his eye made me feel like I'd somehow been abusing him for years, even though we'd never met. Then he pointed to the dog sitting in his car, and he spat, "He'll rip your throat out." Now, this exchange was deeply disturbing to me. The man's reaction was not reality-based. Nothing about what was happening would suggest to a reasonable person that they were in any sort of danger, or that it would be appropriate to say that their dog was going to rip my throat out. I could only assume that in his mind, I somehow represented a grave threat to his physical safety. I became a concrete representation of his internal fear and apprehension. Even though I hadn't done anything to threaten him, our minor interpersonal conflict set in motion a cascade of psychotic anxieties that caused him to significantly distort the situation. Concretization. This is when a person transforms a mental representation into a concrete object, situation, or action. The concrete form is symbolically related to a psychological wish or fear. Many horror movies provide excellent examples of concretized fears or experiences that take physical form to torment the main character. For example, in the movie The Babadook, a mother haunted by unprocessed grief and anger is tormented by a physical manifestation of her feelings, which literally possesses her and causes her to endanger her family. Psychotic fragmentation. This is when self-image, object images, and the links between them become fragmented. Such fragmentation produces a disorganized and confused narrative. It involves total splitting between multiple self-states, fracturing the person into countless pieces that can't be easily linked together. Someone utilizing this defense may appear to ramble incoherently, to vacillate between sudden and frighteningly intense feelings and perceptions, or to construct narratives that seem to contain numerous conflicting organizing themes. Other defenses that are sometimes considered psychotic include omnipotent control. This is an early defense mechanism where the individual believes they have absolute power over their environment and other people. Use of this defense in adulthood reflects a regression to an infantile state of primary narcissism, where the child believes they're the center of the universe and the difference between the real world and the self is obliterated. Primitive idealization and devaluation. This is another early defense mechanism that reflects the young child's need to believe that caregivers are all-powerful and capable of protecting them from all the dangers of life. Normal idealization is an essential component of mature love and represents an adult remnant of the extreme, primitive idealizations that occur in childhood. However, when reality-defying, wholesale idealizations continue to occur in adulthood, it reflects the mind's inability to negotiate the disappointing limitations of the self and other people, or the person's need to believe that a perfect, all-powerful figure in their life can protect them from the paranoid anxieties that threaten to overwhelm the fragile self. Primitive devaluation is the other side of the coin. The fantasized perfection of the idealized self or idealized object will eventually collapse into an equally distorted devaluation. Primitive forms of projection and introjection. These represent early defense mechanisms that intensely blur the boundary between the self and other people. They come from a very early period in psychological development, before we've discerned which experiences are coming from inside the self and which are coming from the external world. These defenses are powerful, but also costly because they disrupt relationships. Most of us only use them under extreme circumstances. We tend to project when something coming from inside the self is too threatening, and we introject when something is so emotionally disruptive that it overwhelms our ego boundaries. The extent of reality distortion is what distinguishes primitive projection from non-psychotic forms of projection. For example, individuals who exhibit extreme xenophobia, racism, or paranoid obsessions about immigrants or, quote, others, who they believe are attacking them and against whom they feel they must defend, are sometimes experiencing a psychotic form of projection in which the others typically possess qualities that the individuals themselves are attempting to disown. Primitive introjection is essentially the reverse of projection. It involves perceiving something that is outside the self as coming from inside the self. Individuals with psychotic organizations have extremely porous, sometimes basically non-existent, boundaries. They can be profoundly confused about what is inside the self and what is not. What boundaries they do have can be easily overwhelmed in the face of threatening or emotionally disruptive experiences. I once worked with a patient who experienced any confrontation as a dire threat. When I would make even basic interpretations or challenges in treatment, their face would contort into a grimace, their body posture would shift into a defensive hunch, and they would glare as though suddenly filled with decades' worth of resentment. In these moments, the patient was introjecting the aggression that they perceived to be coming from me. Healthier individuals might feel a bit confronted by a difficult interpretation in treatment. They might even imagine that I was mad at them. But they would also have the ego functions to sort out what was mine and what was theirs. But this patient was psychotically organized and unable to perceive those distinctions. My perceived anger bypassed their ego boundaries entirely and became their anger. They were, in a way, fused with it, and they embodied it in real time. Another patient had a controlling parent who routinely obliterated their boundaries when they were young. As an adult, they could sometimes, quote, hear that parent's voice speaking in the background of their thoughts. It felt like the controlling, domineering parent was somehow inside of them, the voice speaking on its own, but also in a way that felt fused with their own thoughts. There are other defenses that could probably be included here because they sometimes take on a psychotic quality. But the focus of this channel is pathological narcissism and NPD, so I want to spend a few minutes discussing that specifically. First, we would automatically assume that someone with a narcissistic personality style, organized at the psychotic level, has NPD. Personality disorders are generally conceptualized as occurring exclusively in the psychotic and borderline ranges of functioning. At these levels, the ego functions are not sufficiently developed to contain and channel the person's core conflicts. Instead, the individual is chronically overwhelmed by them and tends to express them via maladaptive strategies and the use of problematic defenses. A psychotic individual with NPD would rely on many of the defenses discussed in this video. Their self-image would be notably distorted. whether in a positive or negative direction. They would be prone to periodic experiences of psychotic fragmentation, during which they would appear to lose coherence in their self-concept. They would be preoccupied with paranoid anxiety about loss of self or collapse of their self-image. Many of these preoccupations would involve reality-distorting defenses. They would likely have obsessions about, quote, others, paranoid beliefs about immigrants, people of other races, or criminals onto whom they had projected many of their own negative qualities. They would also likely be prone to reality-bending grandiosities that were obvious fabrications. Their grandiosity would have a detached from reality quality. They might call themselves perfect. They might believe themselves to be a god on earth, the second coming of Jesus or other deity, or a long-awaited hero who will save the earth. Conversely, a psychotic person with NPD might believe themselves to be hideously grotesque. They might experience obsessions or body dysmorphia that lead them to engage in self-harm or self-mutilation, multiple plastic surgeries, dangerous diets, etc. Psychotic NPD can also present with severe illness anxiety or other disorders that take on a reality-distorting quality. Psychotic individuals, regardless of personality style, often have a history of attempts to self-medicate using drugs and alcohol. Now, in some ways, the appearance of psychotically organized individuals is similar across all personality styles, and this is because of how early in development these issues are thought to originate, essentially freezing parts of the personality in a proto- or undeveloped state. Psychotically organized individuals are intolerant of their own selfhood. The mind unconsciously attacks its own abilities to make meaning out of experience. There's an intense and primitive fear of both being a self and also of dissolving into non-being. Because the immature self-structure present in psychotically organized individuals can cause such abject confusion and fear, it can actually cause those around them to take a caretaking role. To be clear, psychotic individuals are typically at risk for abuse from other people. However, individuals in this range of functioning can also be unpredictable, impulsive, or even dangerous under the right circumstances. They may believe that they're fighting for their very survival in situations where most people would only be mildly anxious. Recall the man who threatened to have his dog tear my throat out because I asked him to move his car. If you begin to suspect that a person is psychotic, then it's best to avoid confrontations. It's likely that they won't be able to engage in rational or productive discourse. They will more likely perceive your confrontation as a threat, confusing it with already terrifying, primitive anxieties that can't be effectively managed. The best thing to do is to be supportive, but boundaried. Offer reassurances if the person is frightened, and seek help if the person is a danger to themselves or to someone else. You might be wondering if psychotic organizations can be healed. I think the answer is yes, but it takes a long time. Psychotic organizations represent profound developmental arrests. The person simply hasn't had the right experiences over long enough periods of time to help them grow and develop the necessary ego functions to cope. The good news is that our minds want to develop. To use the language of Carl Rogers, there's an actualizing tendency in all living things. With time and care, a person can develop the abilities they lack. Progressing to the next developmental level requires ego functions that are capable of handling distress without warping reality or obliterating the distinction between what's inside and what's outside the self. All of this is possible, and there are documented cases of people who have done this work and who've come out the other side. So if you recognize these qualities in yourself or a loved one, don't despair. The next video in this series will discuss borderline organization, which represents the next step on the developmental continuum toward healthy psychology. As always, leave questions or comments, and until next time, take good care.